And welcome back. We have a 2003 Pontiac Aztek, and I believe it has a bad wheel bearing. If you're driving this thing down the road, you could definitely hear it. The faster you drive, the louder the noise gets. So I'm going to go ahead and jack up the vehicle from right here. It's a strong and safe place to jack it up from. And of course, we're going to be using jack stands as always, because relying on a floor jack just isn't safe. And as soon as I get this vehicle lifted, I'm gonna go ahead and spin the suspected bad wheel bearing, and you're gonna see how loud it is. When you spin the wheel, it should not be this loud, so just go ahead and listen to it. So of course the loud horrible sound is a dead giveaway of a bad wheel bearing, but you could also grab it on the left and the right side of the tire and just give it a shake. As you can see, there is some wobble in this one. And you could also do it top and bottom, and again the same thing, there's going to be a wobble and maybe even a slight noise, and that's another indication of a bad wheel bearing. Now I'm going to be using my impact gun, which is why I lifted up the truck first, and now I'm going to be taking off the wheel. But if you do not have an impact gun, you want to make sure to loosen your lug nuts while the vehicle is still on the ground. And now it's time to remove the drum, but first you want to make sure that your parking brake cable is not engaged, because if it is, you're never going to get this drum off. As you can see, I'm just kind of wiggling it back and forth and slowly walking it off. Some of them do come off easier than others. If you're just giving you a hard time, try using a small hammer and tapping around the perimeter. Eventually it will come off. Now here's a night and day difference of the old wheel bearing versus a new one. You can clearly tell the difference in them. And here's the old wheel bearing that's still attached to the vehicle. As you can see, it's held on with 4 fasteners. Now it looks like the hub is in the way, but there is a hole that's drilled into the hub. So as you rotate it, it's going to give you access to each of the fasteners to remove them. Now of course I'm going to be using my impact gun because I have it, and it just makes the job go so much faster. But it doesn't mean you can't get this done with regular hand tools. Here I am using a standard 3/8 ratchet, and as you can see, the fasteners come out just fine. Now that we have all 4 fasteners removed, I can see that there's a good amount of rust around here, so I'm just going to go ahead and spray it with some penetrating oil. At this point I pulled out my BFH and I gave the wheel bearing a few taps, but it was not going. So at this point, if you hit your wheel bearing with a hammer and it just falls right out, you're extremely lucky. Unfortunately for me, that's not the case. Here I have one of the OEM bolts that came out of the wheel bearing, and on the right side of it you can see that I have another bolt that I found in my garage. It's slightly longer, but it's the same exact thread pitch. The only other difference here is that it's a 15mm head instead of a 13, and I really think that 15mm head is what's key in all of this. So what we're going to do is thread it into one of the original holes where we removed one of the 4 bolts, and you want to make sure you get it in there really good. Just you don't have to bottom it out, you want to just get it in there far enough so that when you put the socket on the head of the bolt, it's going to clear the hub. And now that we have the socket in place, we can now rotate the hub without it hitting or catching on anything. Now you're going to notice that there's another drilled hole on the hub, but it's a slightly smaller diameter. So now the socket does not fit through that hole, and we're going to use that to our advantage. So at this point, all you have to do is start backing out that bolt, and the socket is going to start pressing on the hub and essentially pressing out the wheel bearing. Now if we come from the back side, we can see exactly what I'm talking about. As you start to back out that bolt that you're using now as a press, you can see the wheel bearing separating from the rest of the car. Now with the method I just showed you, I was able to completely remove my wheel bearing, but for some reason if your wheel bearing does not want to come off, you could easily just repeat that process on a different bolt hole until the wheel bearing does come out. At this point I was kind of having a blonde moment and I didn't even realize it, but I took the socket off of the bolt, I placed it onto my ratchet, and here I am placing it right back onto the bolt again. And I didn't even realize I was doing this until I was here editing the video, so I just thought that was kind of funny. Now the wheel bearing is completely removed, but now we have a new problem. I can't get the backing plate to remove from the wheel bearing, so it's still kind of stuck together, and it's just mainly because of corrosion and rust and all that stuff. But what I'm gonna do here is jam some type of tool. I just found whatever fits, honestly, and you could just do the same, but basically jam it between the car and the actual wheel bearing itself. You don't want it touching the actual plate right here, any of this stuff. You just want it to touch the wheel bearing itself. And I'm using this short extension here, and I'm just gonna go ahead and hit the backing plate with my hammer a few times. And by giving it a good few whacks, you could see that the wheel bearing is separated from the backing plate now. Now at this point I still have two bolts that are holding the wheel bearing in place, the two bolts on the left side. I did kind of reinstall them, and the reason for that is you don't want all of this stuff crashing down on you when you finally get it loose. So you want to make sure you have something holding the wheel bearing. On top of that, you got to consider that your wheel cylinder is still connected to your brake line, and you don't want all of that weight on your brake line. You could possibly break it. So when it comes time to actually pull the wheel bearing off, you want to just grab this whole assembly how I'm doing here and just kind of hold it up. Here I just grabbed the nearest item, which was a screwdriver, and I just kind of jammed it in there to support everything, which later on I had the bright idea of just grabbing two of the bolts that belong in here and just kind of thread them back in to hold everything. But yeah, you could see all of the corrosion that's in here, and this is what was holding my wheel bearing in place, and trust me, it was a tough one to get off. Now before you go ahead and slap on a new wheel bearing, you want to take your time to clean any rust and corrosion out of here, because the new wheel bearing has to sit nice and flat, and if there's anything in its way, there's a possibility that the wheel bearing can sit cocked one side or another, and that's going to cause a crazy wobble while you're driving on the road. So it's really important. Here I am using a screwdriver and a hammer as kind of like a hammer and a chisel, and it's just to get off any big chunks of rust. I can't stress it enough how important it is to get this step done right, because if you don't do this, trust me, you're going to be back in here again doing the job all over again. Now to try to prevent the wheel bearing from sticking like the old one did, I'm going to cover the whole backside right where it mates up against the car with anti-seize. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but you know, I like to try to make it easier the next time myself or anyone else has to come in here and try to change out this wheel bearing. And now that we got all of the hard work done, reassembly is pretty easy and straightforward. We're gonna go ahead and remove these bolts here, but remember to support the whole assembly here, because again, the brake line is still attached. And now we could get our new wheel bearing and put it on. You shouldn't fumble too much with this, because it should all just kind of fall into place. And once it falls into place, you just kind of get your bolt started. You put one in, and after you get that one in, everything else is just a walk in the park. Now out of force of habit, I'm just gonna go ahead and apply some blue thread locker here. Now I didn't see any thread locker on here when I initially removed the bolts, but I figure it couldn't hurt. It's just a little bit of added security, because you definitely do not want these bolts backing out on you. And now it's time to tighten down or torque down the wheel bearing. Now I looked online real quick and I could not find any hardcore facts on what the actual specs are for this wheel bearing. So what I did was I started off at 65 foot-pounds, and it just didn't feel right. Anyone who's worked on cars long enough knows exactly what I'm talking about. when you're right at that point where you're about to pull threads on a fastener because you're just exceeding its limits. So I ended up backing it down to 60 foot-pounds, and it was a little bit better but not quite there, and I ended up settling in at 55 foot-pounds. At that point, all 4 fasteners torqued down nice and even, and I didn't feel like there was any possibility to pull any threads at 55 foot-pounds. But I do encourage you to go out and do your own research and try to find these torque specs for this wheel bearing. If you do manage to find something, please leave a comment below, and that way I could pin the comment and share it with everyone else. Before you slap on your drum, you want to check the inside of it. If there's any rust on it, you want to make sure to clean that up right where it mates up against the new wheel bearing, just to make sure it sits nice and flush. And now we can reinstall the wheel, lower the vehicle back on the ground, and torque all of the lug nuts down to spec. Now that everything is done, I took the vehicle out for a test drive, and that loud annoying sound is completely gone, so that's a fix. And that's it. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, Patreon, you know, all that social media garbage. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you're considering subscribing, don't forget to hit that notification bell. And like always, thanks for watching.